So this is the start of episode 3 of the Riptide Lab podcast. And today Dom and I are reviewing Strixhaven, which has been completely spoiled over the weekend. And I want to start by talking about the lesson and learn mechanic. I think as soon as something like this comes out, Riptiders tend to go a bit off the deep end. I've seen mentioning of squadron picking, mentioning of changing spells that have the lesson subtype, and including things like traps and arcane as things you can tutor up. I do love this mechanic um, in a limited and standard setting, that you are able to build your deck with this cool little tutor toolbox and search up spells that will change kind of their contextual power level through the course of the game. Um, but from Cube, it's maybe not serving that same purpose, I feel like.
Okay, so I think this mechanic will be great for draft. If you're drafting Strixhaven, then you expect to see lessons in the packs and maybe build around them, and you get these interesting decision points in the draft where you don't know necessarily if this lesson is going to be better for your deck than another card in the same pack, but it's a good speculative pick because if you pick up learn cards in future picks, then it can tie into those neatly. And then maybe you even have this question of, do I want this lesson in my deck just to draw, or do I want it as a thing that I can learn for, but then that adds a kind of bunch of mana to access that if I need it urgently. So a lot of interesting things going on there for sure. The issue is, for Cube at least, that as you get to really any kind of, I mean, not even medium power, but low power, a lot of the lessons just don't seem like they can function as cards in themselves. And so if you want to add these into your draft environment, then you basically have to go through the learn mechanic. And at that point, there's a lot of additional overhead for your drafters. So once you've made the choice of, do you get these lessons automatically when you draft a learn card? Is there some kind of shared pool of lessons that each person who drafts a learn card can take from? Those are questions as a designer that you have to confront at the
Hmm.
outset. But I think there's also a big kind of complexity that this introduces where to me, the litmus test is always, if someone who doesn't know this mechanic, they kind of checked out of Magic, they only draft every few months or so. If they're drafting your cube and they see a card with learn on it, okay, their eyes scan the text quickly to figure out what's going on, and then it doesn't make sense immediately because now they have to open up the separate compartment of your cube box that contains all the lessons and then scan those to see which of those that they might like. That's a big commitment to make, especially
Hmm.
when you don't want to be holding the entire draft up and you have a bunch of other cards in the pack that maybe you're not familiar with either, and you're going to shortcut that by just ignoring that part of the learn mechanic altogether. So I think the lessons side of things, you do have to think carefully about both the mechanics and also the trade-offs involved with putting this in your cube. And that's something that holds me back on it, even though it is, I think, a really interesting and intricate mechanic. I do think as well that all of this discussion around lessons overshadows what may actually be the more revolutionary part of this mechanic, and that's just the fallback option, the
Hmm.
discard a card to draw a card, and that kind of rummaging is what became the term for it after rummaging goblin many years ago. That was something that was added to red primarily as a way to give red its own distinct color identity when it came to card draw and card filtering, and that went hand in hand later on with these XL the top card, and then you can play that card with conditions thing that red has become very good at. But that was very much a red thing. And so blue just got the best card draw because it's blue, why wouldn't it? And then black, you could draw cards pretty well, but you would have to pay some life to do it. And then red, you would get to rummage. And then eventually green got all different kinds of card advantage and became like the default card advantage color, at least when it came to standard. And then white was just white and couldn't draw a card to save its life. And that is basically still true as far as I can tell. Um,
Slowly changing.
And in this set, actually, and in the Commander product coming along with it, we are seeing how white can slowly venture into that space more. But for the most part, this kind of rummaging was a red thing, and now we are just offhandedly, as a kind of default fallback option, giving every color the ability to do that, and that's a
Hmm.
big deal. Where if you find a graveyard cube, for example, on Cube Cobra, often you look down the colors on that cube, and it's okay. I can see how this works in black and green and red and so on. And then white is just, I guess we have the three discard effects in white that have ever been printed, and also a bunch of reanimation, and we cross our fingers and hope that's enough to flesh out an entire color. And now white just gets to double, triple its total number of good discard effects just at the tip of a pen like that. That's so good. That's so much design space that gets opened up almost by accident for white. And the same goes for other colors too. Like when you try to support Reanimator in a cube, it quickly becomes clear that black does not actually have that many good discard outlets.
No.
It has good self-mill nowadays. You got Entomb and Buried Alive if you want to really just skip right to the action. But when it comes to discard effects, especially discarding cards to then draw more cards, black doesn't really get to do that, and now it does. That's changing. And you know what? I think the best learn card in the set may be the Gnarled Professor, the green one, the rare Tree Folk.
Hmm.
That green is a card advantage color now, but even there, this is breaking new ground in green. So this is the kind of less flashy half of a new mechanic, which by itself is more groundbreaking than really any mechanic we've seen recently.
Yeah, I do like how they tried to make it a bit less poisonous in that way, and I think that some of these learn cards are fairly aggressively statted if you would think of them as having the word like draw a card instead of learn, which I don't think that any of these lessons fully will represent a full card most of the time at a cube power level. But when you talk about the amount of work that you need to do in order to support this mechanic, um, in Strixhaven they have 20 different lessons in the set, and I was looking up the math I did in an old Channel Fireball article where the average common appears almost 2.5 times a draft, and I think the average uncommon was like 1.2 times. So if you add it all up, you're probably getting like, I don't know, probably upwards of 30, maybe 40 lessons per draft in a full 8-player set. And I don't think you're going to be dedicating that much space to it in Cube. And I don't think it's a very interesting mechanic if you don't have multiple lessons to choose from when you go to do the wishing.
Yeah, I think the only way to make this work, unless you are the most slow pace of pauper or peasant cubes, is to just give someone the lesson they want to learn, right? Which takes some of the fun out of it, but it's a necessary sacrifice, I think, if you want to make the mechanic work. And then you get into questions of, okay, well, what if two different players at the same time both have a learn card in their deck and they end up wanting the same lesson? So,
I have a
but
plan for that actually.
okay,
So this
let's
is
hear
not a
it.
long-term thing, but I think what I want to do when Strixhaven releases on Moto is I'll set up the Hearthstone drafting app so that by default it puts all of the lessons into your sideboard. And
Okay.
we'll load up both accounts with all the lessons and then just kind of like play with these learn cards in a best case scenario. And I think that'll be fun to see them like at their theoretical best in a cube environment for a couple weeks, and then I'll just kind of go back to the normal thing. But I think in terms of a digital format, that seems like a fun experiment for the short term at least.
And when it comes to paper, I think all of these lessons will be cheap enough that you could just order a playset of the lessons without breaking the bank at all, and that should be fine.
Yeah. I do wonder, I guess the price will always be fairly driven by standard. Actually, from what I heard, these lessons can't be tutored for at all in Commander, so that shouldn't be. Sometimes you see these prices that are just kind of don't make any sense to me from a person who's played a lot of Cube and Constructed, and I think the answer is always that Commander's driving the price spike. Yeah,
It
to
is
me,
it is amusing in an era where so much card design is explicitly geared towards not just multiplayer but Commander specifically. That you now have a mechanic that is completely non-functional in Commander. I just like the kind of at least the old school Magic players among us are still getting our own territory in
yeah.
there.
Is it off-putting to you to see these cards in a regular set that say like choose target opponent and then that opponent does something? Like it's all this extra rules baggage that makes the cards so much wordier than they need to be. Like,
Yeah, there is a lot of that, and the most egregious examples are so the white black silver quill. I'm gonna say elder dragon in this set,
hmm,
where it doesn't really it still works in a two-player game. Like the card has text that functions under the rules, but it is so much less appealing to play that card in any kind of a heads up Magic game versus three or more players. um
hmm,
i I like it when there is a base case where the card functions in two-player Magic as you kind of would expect a Magic card to, and then it has the ability to scale into multiplayer in an interesting way. It does feel more jarring sometimes where you have these cards in the main Magic products, which don't really do that. Like to me, that is some kind of red line where I think the snooty purist in me thinks Magic fundamentally is a two-player game and cards should be crafted around that expectation that they function in a two-player environment. And if in the supplementary Commander products you want to add in a bunch of stuff that is geared towards multiplayer, then yeah, go ahead, go nuts. But I to me, I like it when a card is both functional and elegant as a heads up Magic card, and then has other applications. And once you've played Magic for long enough, you see this kind of baggage everywhere, where there are so many cards which are conceptually simple, but have to be worded in such a way under Magic legalese that it's just so daunting to look at them. And we spoke about this with the like Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead discussion
hmm.
on a previous episode. There are a lot of cards like that, so some amount of that is just baked into the Magic rules engine. But trying to balance the needs of heads up Magic and multiplayer at the same time does add a whole new layer of complexity to that.
So on the topic of card elegance, I have
Yes, or lack thereof.
yeah. So I've done a Scryfall search for the modal dual face cards in this set, and there are some novels here, and I'm only looking at one half of the card.
It's I remember when we saw Questing Beast previewed, and it was like, how do they fit this many words onto a Magic card? And now in every single set, we're seeing like whole cycles of those cards which have that many words on each side.
Yeah.
You finish one card and you just about have wrapped your head around it, and then that card just has another side which is equally long. So it's really pushing the envelope in terms of how much complexity they're willing to allow on a card. And I remember, like, you can go back and look at the notes from the great designer searches, or the set design notes that Mark Rosewater would write about for each set. And this is a theme that they would repeat time and time again: is don't add so much unnecessary complexity that it bogs the game down, because
Yeah.
Magic is already, both in rules terms and strategic terms, a very complicated game. You don't need to pile that on when you don't need to. And these cards just really are doing that to the point where some of them, which I think would be eye-catching designs on an individual level, where either half of the card is powerful or deep in some way, some of that gets lost in the shuffle because there's so much additional text that it's hard to pass to the whole thing to find exactly what's interesting. And you could argue that's a case of like additive distraction, where in theory, you look at one of these double face cards. If one face appeals to you, it should not matter that there is another face, obscuring things, or if anything, that should make the card even more interesting. But in practice, it does seem to, you know, I look at some of these cards and my eyes just glaze over and I move on to the next thing. And I'm someone who, as I said, it is my job to think about Magic, and casually I spend a lot of time thinking about Magic. And even I am finding myself just kind of checking out mentally when I see some of these cards. So, God knows how the less engaged viewer thinks about it.
Yeah, I can't imagine, like, so back when I ran my cube and paper, we had a lot of people, like, we would plan for an 8-person draft, and inevitably we would end up a player or two short from people bailing at the last minute. And we would get people filling in who were just kind of playing casual games, because we'd play at the game shop and we'd get, a 7th or 8th sub in. And Cube's already so complex that I can't imagine that any of these cards do enough for your environment to justify just the overwhelming complexity penalty that they bring with them.
Yeah, I see that eighth player that you need to make up the numbers as that is the man or woman on the street, right? And I
Mm.
want them to at least enjoy the experience of drafting my cube, even if it might feel a bit overwhelming. I don't want them to run screaming for the hills because none of this makes any sense to them, which I feel like is it quickly becomes the case once you add too many of these cards.
Do you think that there's a threshold where, I don't know, say this like Valentine card gets played enough in Constructed that somehow the populace becomes kind of familiar with it, and they don't have to read this text to be able to parse it, they just see the picture and know it. Is there some level of prominence that these cards could reach that would make you reevaluate whether you include them?
I think so, yeah. And you do run into these odd questions of if Valentin by itself is a card you would consider for your cube, and I think Lisette is the other side. If that also individually is a card you would consider for your cube, in theory, it's only upside for the two of them to be stapled to the same card because that frees up a slot, or maybe you could even run two copies of that card and then you get some
Mm.
interesting modality introduced there as well. But I think you need to get to the point where either one side is so iconic and worthwhile that you would play it no matter what other accoutrements you put on top. Yeah, a great example there, yeah. Or both sides are popular and well known enough that sticking them together mentally doesn't have any friction associated with it. And Cosima is a great example of a card where, like, maybe I would consider Cosima by itself or the Omen Keel by itself. And so, yeah, why not consider Cosima slash the Omen Keel?
Mm.
But the answer is, again, it's like already one side is so complicated and the other side is so complicated that I don't fully believe that anyone has actually successfully read the whole thing and understood it on a first viewing, because there's some like linguistic ambiguity as well, which maybe is cleared up in other languages. I don't know, but you would think that if you're going to do this as a consistent project, and we know that there is a through line between the Zendikar Rising DFCs to the Coldheim ones to the Strixhaven ones, and then also in the autumn we're getting two Innistrad sets, both of
Mm.
which will be very DFC heavy. And of course, the original Innistrad was what introduced the DFCs into Magic. It seems like the template should be okay if we're going to do something very ambitious and very wordy on one side, the other side should have this explicit simplicity to it. But that seems to be the opposite of the case now. And
Well, what I heard actually is that and this may be untrue, but I read it on our forum, so it's very possibly untrue, is that the Strixhaven ones were the first modal double face cards released, and then they were the first ones designed, and then they designed the Kaldheim ones, and then they designed the Zendikar Rising ones. And so I
Okay.
feel like if that's their evolution in terms of like the direction that they went through, that I feel like the way that Zendikar did it was great. You know, like you can parse the entire backside of the card just by the little reminder in the bottom left. You know what the
Mm.
backside of that card is going to do. But these new ones, I feel like you can't. You're gonna have a pack of 15 cards in your hand, and then like take the card out of the sleeve and flip it around. I just don't see it working well in that setting.
It is fascinating to think about how these will be received once Paper Magic returns in a big way, because there are cards which very few people, especially in some of Magic's biggest consumer markets, have ever actually played with in person, right? And
Mm.
so one example that came up with was a crystalline giant from Ikoria, where you're rolling a die to add a different type of counter every turn. And
Oh
if you're
yeah.
doing that on a digital platform, that's easy. It just does it for you, and it's clear visually what extra abilities it has. But you can imagine the bookkeeping for that card being really just not worth the trouble when it comes to paper, right? And so you can see some signs of the shift towards digital design, if you want to call it that, when it comes to Magic, and maybe the DFCs are a good example of that, where if you have this card in your hand on Arena, you can mouse over it and it shows you the other side, and then it's and like the opening game animation is you draw your hand and then the DFCs kind of revolve themselves, so you can see um, what's a DFC and what each side is. So some of that complexity is handled for you. But I was saying to some friends the other day that the first tournaments after Paper Magic returns, there is going to be a lot of people just having to get cards out of their sleeve and then flip them around. And then what happens if they're double sleeved or inner sleeved? And then at the end of games, people will be like forgetting to turn them back around to their front faces. And God knows what happens when someone like shuffles their companion into their deck and then tries to reveal it for game two and it's not there anymore, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that will make
Yeah.
those
You're gonna
first
have
few
to remind your
tournaments very
friends to take
messy.
out their lessons between rounds.
Oh, that too. Yeah, a lot of judge calls surrounding that, I bet, as well. So I don't know. There's a lot going on here, and maybe that's the point, right? Where if you think this is going to be a long-term project, where for at least 5 or 6 sets in a row, and maybe in the long-term future of Magic, you want this design space to be a permanent fixture, then eventually it will reach this level of complexity. So why not kind of jump there now, get players accustomed to it, and so by the time you get to the fifth set where you have a cycle of rare DFCs, this is old news to them at this point.
Hmm. Yeah. So, jumping to our next topic, there's a new, I believe, evergreen mechanic in this set, Magecraft. And personally, I don't know how you feel. I was never that big of a fan of prowess, especially in a cube setting.
Yeah, I liked Paris a lot, but making it work was often easier said than done. And one thing that you quickly discovered when you tried to make it work was that Paris was so much less restrictive than the old model, which is kind of embodied in Magecraft of just casting instants and sorceries, where
Hmm.
you would like when you went looking for them, there were a lot of just artifacts or enchantments or planeswalkers that you would end up casting or wanting to include in your deck, and having those contribute to the prowess trigger count was actually a surprisingly big part of making that entire mechanic work. And I think we will realize how spoiled we were by prowess when we try to make Magecraft work in a cube setting. One thing I do like about Magecraft is it fixes one of these weird accounting quirks that this kind of mechanic used to have, where when you copy a spell, intuitively, I would say at least 9 times out of 10, a player will think, okay, that should mean it triggers prowess, right? Or that means I'm
Hmm.
casting a spell. And that was one of those things in a competitive setting where you always felt you were kind of getting away with something.
Yeah.
If, you know, oh, yeah, I cast a storm spell, but I'm not actually triggering prowess or whatever, because that's not how the comprehensive rules book. You always felt like you were just making it up as you went along because it was convenient for you. And you could maybe accept the explanation if you were on the other end of that, but it never felt good, right? So this clears up some of that intuition, which I think is a really good thing, and also opens up some of that design space where you can actually go off with Storm in a new way now, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not just I cast 5 spells and I cast my Envy the Warrens. It's I have a Magecraft card and I play a spell or two. I play a storm spell, and oh look, I get a bunch of cool stuff going on. So I do like that aspect of it as well. And I'm sure Crow Storm will pick up in cubes in a big way now or something. But yeah, I mean, I like that this is obvious design space that they've gone back to time and time again. I think this is a good way of doing it. I just don't know if that actually moves the needle in terms of how well it's going to work in a cube setting.
Well, I think for me, there's always this issue, and I have the same thing with Storm, where I feel like the way that they tune and balance these cards, um, they have to put kind of like a cap on how strong they can be because of the way that you can build constructed decks that you can really, you know, build something to cast a ton of different spells over and over. And
I've
that's not something you're ever going to be getting in Cube, that same kind of focus with your deck.
Have you seen the Chain of Smog combos with Magecraft?
Yeah, and I don't.
Let's bring up Chain of Smog for the uninitiated here, because that's not a card I expect people to know just off the top of their head. So this is the weirdest card in an already very strange and obscure cycle from Onslaught, close to 20 years ago now. So the way this is worded means you can Chain of Smog yourself and then just keep copying it over and over. And you ditch your whole hand in the process. But if you have a Magecraft trigger, you're getting infinite copies of that trigger. So that's probably going to be worth it in the end.
Mm,
And so this adds a whole new range of like Splinter Twin style combos to Legacy, certainly, but also to the Cube card pool. And I've often felt that the twin combo coasts by in Cube because of how much residual affection people have from Modern and Standard for it, even though I don't think it's a good design or a good choice to include in your cube. So I hope that those people will, follow that principle to its natural conclusion and end up including stuff like Chain of Smog, because,
they're
why
going
not kill
to.
people on turn 2, right? Like that sounds like good, clean, wholesome fun.
I mean, I saw there was like a Strixhaven hot takes article on Cube Cobra today, going in depth on all the interactions with Chain of Smog and all the cards that can infinite combo with it. And so I expect this to become yet another card that dissuades me from participating in like vintage cube drafts on MTGO. But I don't know. It's kind of, there was someone brought up in our Discord like the that Andrea Mengucci is having his cube on Moto, and then they saw that Time Vault was in the cube, and they were just like immediately turned off from it. So I think there's like a pretty big I guess disconnect between how people on our website tend to evaluate cubes versus maybe the mass market. And I expect this to be another one of those dividing points.
Yeah, and Mengucci's cube, my impression is that is almost the platonic ideal of a vintage cube done right. If you really enjoy playing with all of the most powerful cards from throughout Magic's history. You want to see all of the broken stuff going on and hopefully be the one inflicting the broken stuff on your opponent. That is the kind of cube that you want to draft, much more so actually than the traditional Modo vintage cube. So maybe this is
Mhm.
a good model for how that should look going ahead. But yeah, a lot of funky stuff you can do with Magecraft. One thing that you see in this set though is the main mechanics, both Magecraft and learning and lessons, are spread across all 5 colors.
Mhm.
So you would think Magecraft would fit in some kind of Ravnica block as the is it mechanic, right? Or typically most sets nowadays have themes for each of their 2 color pairs, and so this would make a lot of sense in a generic Magic set as the blue-red color pair mechanic. But here you get it in all 10 color pairs and all 5 colors. So you have green Magecraft and black Magecraft and white Magecraft. And so in theory, that opens up a lot of space to bring those mechanics into all 5 colors in Cube. I don't know how well that's going to work in practice though, because I've mentioned before that I found even the blue-red versions of those decks to be kind of a trap. And so if you're introducing a inherently less well supported version into all 5 colors, you will get a lot of people who try to build some like black green Magecraft deck and end up floundering horribly because you could be the best drafter, best player in the world. The support just
Mhm.
isn't there to make that work.
What
And
I like about it though is that with Magecraft, you can theoretically put on like triggers that trigger off of Magecraft that are more meaningful than a 1 turn +1/+1 effect. And I don't know that it'll be a thing, but if you look at this Extus card, the black-white legendary, that the Magecraft trigger, you're getting a creature back from the graveyard, and I imagine there are some interesting shenanigans that you can do with that that don't necessarily require you to have a super high instant and sorcery density.
Mm-hmm. Or one good example, which may be the most exciting card in the set for some people, is the witch, the Sedgemoor witch.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of upgraded young pyromancer or young pestomancer, as someone called
Oh,
it.
I love that.
Yeah. So this is, I think, actually a big upgrade over pyromancer in the sense that the body is relevant, and I found that to be a good an important buff for any kind of spell seeker or spell slinger mechanic is when your cards just function well by themselves and they're more than just a random goblin piker. And so with this, you have a 3/2 menace, which is 5 base stats for a 3-drop already, and then you add on this ability where you can really push that to the extreme.
Mm.
And in constructed, historic pioneer, you see the like black red Arcanist decks where they're trying to cast a bunch of super cheap spells in the same turn, and black has a lot of those actually. You've got your Thoughtseize and Inquisition, and then Fatal Push, a bunch of the removal, and extending that to the entire cube card pool. Yeah, you get like Vampiric Shooter or Reanimate, or God knows how deep you want to go on that, but
Mm.
you could very conceivably build like a black spell slinger style deck, and that would be a centerpiece of it.
Yeah, I think to me this card really checks all the boxes that like you can take it because it's a good kind of efficient card, and then if you are able to leverage all the synergy you can with it off of, I mean, you can do some intersection of like spell slinger aristocrat stuff with this card, which I think is really cool if it would ever come together. And then a card that I don't particularly like is the Symmetry Sage. I've seen some people calling it the new Delver, but the number of spells that you're casting per turn in a cube match is usually not that significant.
Yeah, this is the kind of card that I imagine will be great in, Pauper or a larger format where you can make sure your deck has a 31 drop instants
Wait,
or
is
sorceries in it.
Pauper common only?
Common only, yeah. And then I guess
So
Peasant is common or uncommon, but that format doesn't really get played at all.
No.
Um, but yeah, so the Symmetry Sage is a great card, but I don't know if it's really going to cut it in any kind of cube context. And you might think, okay, maybe it's not going to be a fit for Vintage Cube, but at a lower power level, we can make this work. And the issue there tends to be that the kind of cheap spells that you need to make a spell slinger mechanic really tick, those are all quite high powered spells. So if you think your format is at the point where you don't want people casting preordain and lightning bolt and swords of plowshares and stuff, well, it's going to be hard to trigger this early with any kind of consistency in the first place. So the power scaling doesn't quite fit for this kind of effect either.
Yeah. What do you think about Leonin Light Scribe? So this is a Magecraft effect where it buffs your whole team for the turn, and it's going into a traditionally token-heavy color in white.
I really like this card. I don't know if it's going to be as good as I want it to be. But this is that kind of effect done right, I think, where you can set up for some massive mid game or late game turn where you either kind of ambush the opponent by casting this and then casting several spells on the same turn, or you just have this on the battlefield and then suddenly turn 5 you cast a spell, you cast another spell that maybe removes their blocker, and all of your team now has +2/+2, and you just win the game out of nowhere. That's really cool, and that's a great thing to be able to build towards. And so I could see wanting to push this card in my cube, even if I'm skeptical about the mechanic as a whole, or I'm kind of cooling on the whole Praris thing,
Mm-hmm.
especially as it applies to white, because I don't think you need that many spells or that many spells in a certain window for this to be a good magic card in your deck.
You just need Lingering Souls, and then
Yeah,
you've got
Battle
both ends of
Screech.
it.
Battle Screech is a great one. I'm sure there are others in white that aren't immediately coming to mind, but you could imagine a deck with like this and Monastery Mentor, right? And you're
Mm-hmm.
just, if you have any kind of cheap spells, and maybe that's your hook into another color. Maybe you go into black for all of that cheap interaction and stuff. Maybe you go into red for burn and looting effects and so on. That can form part of that identity where maybe white has the incentive cards, but then you look to other colors for the cards to make them work. And that could be an interesting way to make this feel like a unique Boros deck or a unique Orzhov deck and so on.
What do you think about this Dragon's Guard Elite? It's the green 2-drop that grows every time you play a instant or sorcery, and we've had a lot of green 2-drops over the years that can grow themselves, and I think this is probably the one that will grow the slowest of those, but it does have this extra ability tacked on.
Yeah, Quirion Dryad, I think, is the most iconic of those, but doesn't see too much play anymore. I think this, you're right that it grows slower than most of the others, but it does so from a higher base where it's a 2/2 versus a 1/1, which, yeah, Vinelash Kazu, another good example, starts as a 1/1, but has another condition to kind of balloon out of control. Um, I think this is a good card, but again, if you're triggering it, it's likely not with green spells most of the time. So
Yeah.
it's going to be in a blue-green deck or a green-red deck, or I imagine this card is going to be. I can see it getting to gigantic proportions in constructed, let's say, where you look over and someone's built this 10/10 2-drop in the space of a few turns and it's just running away with the game by itself. That is not going to happen in cube, and that's where I've mentioned before using constructed as inspiration for what could or couldn't work in cube, and often constructed can be a cautionary tale about what kind of constraints are necessary for something to work. And if you come into cube design with visions of Dragon's Guard Elite consistently being this 7/7 or on turn 4, you will be sorely disappointed because that is just not feasible under any realistic constraints.
Um, Speaking of cautionary tales, so I guess you were around when I tried to make the Lifegain theme work in Cube.
Mm-hmm.
And you made me think of it with The 10/10 creature. So when we tested this card, um, this often got to Eldrazi sizes, and I have a video coming up about kind of like why this life gain theme that I implemented turned out to be quite bad insular design. But just I'm wondering if the card pool has changed enough that it could be put into a cube in a more elegantly designed way, this life gain theme.
I will say, in the past few sets alone, there have been so many good life gain cards that I was working on an Abzan cube on the side, and there were various sub themes in there, and one of them was life gain, and there was a decent life gain deck when I started looking at that about a year ago, and if I were to revisit that now, I would have to completely overhaul that Lifegain section because there have been so many good tools. It's
Mm.
a bounty of riches. Um, that being said, I think all of the criticisms of it in your cube, for example, still apply. And unless something fundamental changes, they will always apply. And unless so many good cards are printed that have other applications that you don't need to do too much explicitly to tie the room together. So it might be easier than ever before to make a Johnny's Pride Mate humongous. More bigger than any 2-drop should reasonably be. But at the end of the day, if that's all you're doing is making a bigger Johnny's Pride Mate, however easy that is, that might never be actually good enough or interesting enough by itself.
Yeah, I guess for me it was less of a question of whether it was good enough. The thing that I discovered to kind of spoil the video for you guys is that um the support cards that you needed, at least at the time, they weren't as like narrow as the support cards that you would use for Storm, but they were in power level just like low enough in raw power that everybody else would pass over them. And if you were in the life gain deck, the synergy that you got out of it bumped it up enough that it was good enough for you. So you had like when you looked at like the demand, everyone else would pass the cards by because there was a better card in the pack, even if it wasn't something super narrow like Empty the Warrens. And then they would get to you as the life gain drafter. And I wonder if that has changed, if there's enough kind of Sedgemoor Witch and Kitchen Finks out there that you can support it without including these cards that are only good enough if you have life gain.
I think the answer may be to have single card life gain build arounds that are worth the effort there by themselves. So, you know, I think Urza is a really cool card and a really powerful card that's worth putting in your cube and doing what you can to make work. And often that has led me astray because I see Urza, I put it in my cube, I always want to draft around it if I see it and then build around it. And so that leads me to just fill out most of my cube sketches by default with a bunch of artifacts in the hope of making this artifact deck into a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've increasingly realized is that Urza as a card, as the most appealing artifact incentive card, doesn't actually need an artifact deck to work, and the artifact deck without Urza wasn't really coming together. And so at that point, it's actually better and also easier for me to just put Urza in my cube, trust that it's powerful enough with enough support that it's just going to come together and be good or maybe even great if I get all those artifacts. But I don't need to play a bunch of cards that I otherwise wouldn't be playing just because I have these love goggles for Urza and want to
Mm.
do whatever I can to make it a 10 out of 10 instead of an 8 out of 10. And I think that might be the key for life gain is to if there's a good life gain card which you can put in your deck and it's great, but then with a few if everything breaks right, then you just raise the roof and go nuts with it. So Archangel of Thune maybe, but I don't think that one's even there, especially since I see Archangel of Thune or I see like Lyra, Baneslayer Angel, any of the other 5-drop angels, and there's such stiff competition that why is that the one that sticks out to me? Alphas makes a good point in the chat that in the Arena Cube there's a good life deck. The Arena Cube, it it's kind of slow enough and also amorphous enough that that kind of thing can work. But as soon as you start building in other themes to your cube, I think that drops off pretty quick. So um, I think it is closer now than it ever has been, and maybe is just one or two cards away, but I still don't think we're there quite yet.
Yeah, I guess the thing that made me think of it was that this Dragon's Guard Elite, like when I was designing the stuff with Pridemate, my thought was, okay, it starts as a 2/2. If it triggers once, you have a 3/3 for 2, and that's kind of like sufficient for what we expect out of a 2-drop beater. And if it grows from there, then that's kind of gravy. And I wonder, I'll have to play with this Dragon's Guard Elite to see how it feels in a cube context where green is not normally the natural pairing for a kind of spell slinger deck. But that said, black isn't either, and I think, you know, at least my cube has a mana base where it's fairly easy to splash for certain things, and I want to put these cards in there and see kind of how it works in a organic draft environment.
Yeah, the Pridemate example is actually on the nose there because a few years ago, there was a white aggro deck in Constructed, which had a Johnny's Pridemate, but was not a life gain deck by any stretch of the imagination. It was just that they wanted a good 2-drop, and if you could trigger Pridemate once, then 2 mana 3/3 is fine for my aggro deck. And then if you could trigger it more often than that, then that was a really serious threat that could win the game by itself. And they didn't need to play a bunch of cards that they weren't playing otherwise. It was just, well, I have 4 Legion's Landing in my deck because that's amazing in a white aggro deck. And oh, look, that token has lifelink. Or
Mm-hmm.
one of the other 1-drops that I want to play, that also has lifelink. And so you start just finding these instances of life gain in your deck, and then Pridemate just kind of slots in neatly, versus what I think most people do, and understandably, which is, I want to build a life gain deck, so I'm starting with my Pridemates and then seeing how I can fill the rest of it out, which gets you to a better Pridemate deck, but a more narrow and maybe worse deck overall.
Yeah, I guess I had, what's that 0 mana artifact that lets you sack lands
Oh,
for?
Zoronorb.
Yeah, so my design was so dumb. It had Zero Orb, and only one player ever really wanted it. I could tell myself that, I don't know, if you were playing these catastrophe type effects, cataclysm, that maybe you would take this, but realistically not. And it had these fun decision points where when you had, say, 2 Pridemates on the board, you always had to decide whether you wanted to just sacrifice all your lands and do nothing for the rest of the game except turn your Pridemate sideways. And I found that kind of a fun tension, but I think it was a short-lived kind of fun where it doesn't have the necessary kind of depth that I want out of my cube experience.
I have a complicated relationship with Zoronorb because you're right that it is an incredibly narrow card, but it's incredibly narrow in so many different decks that maybe in aggregate that translates to something different. Where, so like, you put it in the life gain deck and it's maybe the best life gain payoff you could possibly ask for, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
you put it in some kind of land deck where you have like Titania or Gitrog Monster or Splendid Reclamation, and it's the best enabler for all of those as well. And then maybe you put it in a different sacrifice deck that has like Mayhem Devil or Korvold or something. And I know it's an all-star in like Korvold EDH, for instance. And so if you end up including enough of those where it's like, okay, it's either a 10 out of 10 or a 0 out of 10, but I have somehow 4 different archetypes in which it's a 10 out of 10. Maybe that's good enough by itself. Oh, and then also it's a 0 mana artifact, so maybe it sneaks into the
Yeah.
this hypothetical artifact deck somehow. I don't know. So it's such a beguiling card because it's so weird and unique in the context of Magic history, and also the upside is so amazingly high when it works that it sings this siren song to you. It begs you to put it in your queue, and it makes a very compelling case for itself. But I don't know if you should anyway.
Yeah, I've recently actually decided that. So here's another interaction card with Zero Orb. That Flagstones of Trokair is good enough to make my main cube without any utility land draft shenanigans. I think the cost of putting it in your deck is so low, and the upside to any interaction you have with it is so high that it just makes so many things more satisfying.
I've been pushing Flagstones decks in Modern and Legacy for ages now because the interaction with Elvish Reclaimer is just so strong. Where
Mm-hmm.
you go turn 1 Reclaimer, turn 2 Flagstones, you stack the Flagstones, you get the plains and then another land, which can just be another Flagstones, and then you can repeat that sequence, and you just it really spirals out of control so quickly. And it's a really fun card to try and get the most out of. In a cube environment, maybe something like Harrow or Springloom Druid are good ways to use it. But if you're just sacrificing it for some kind of marginal value, I don't think it really does enough. Like if I stack it to my orb, I gain 2 life. All right, what have I really accomplished in the grand scheme of things, right? I think you need to be using that for ramping of some kind in order to get the most out of it.
Yeah. Do you run Elvish Reclaimer? Because I think I'm putting it in. I'm still catching up on some old cards, and I was watching some Legacy with this, and it looks uh, extremely powerful. Um, but I think I hadn't tested it yet because of its price or something. I don't remember what had held me back.
The issue is that in Constructed, you have specific lands that you want to get with your Reclaimer. So against a graveyard deck, you can find Bojuka Bog, and that makes Reclaimer this terrifying threat by itself. Or
Mm.
in longer games, you can find Field of the Dead and just keep building towards that card. In Cube, it's really hard to find specific lands that you want, and that's what has held me back on fully embracing a lands archetype. It's not that the lands cards themselves don't do anything because they're so good now. It's that the lands themselves just kind of suck, and that's really sad. And I don't know how likely we are to see new lands that fix that because let's say Bazaar of Baghdad is really good in your cube, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a card which is never going to fly under any kind of contemporary design philosophy, right? So maybe you get to cube with one copy of Bazaar of Baghdad, and then you build your deck around it, and maybe your Reclaimer or your Seder Wayfinder or something can help to find it. But that's a very narrow corner case that you can't really rely on.
But you
Or
can
like,
still get the stat boost out of this card. I mean, this is going to
yeah,
be, once you turn it on, like the most aggressively statted one drop in your cube, other than like Figure of Destiny.
and that's the real use case. I think it's a kind of interesting card which in the mid game is, oh, I paid for this back on turn 1, and suddenly it's a 3/4 and it's the biggest creature on the board somehow, and it's just going to start attacking and getting in the red zone. And in that sense, it maybe has the issue that like Tezzeret Agent of Bolus has, where it's in theory it's a cool card that ties a bunch of synergies together, but in practice you just make a big thing and attack with it, and maybe that's what you want, and if so, great. But it pretends to be a synergy card when often those synergies just give way to attacking with your big overstated creature.
Yeah, I guess I always like when you put in these cards that can open up, I don't know, aggro self mill, like some weird kind of hybrid combination of strategies that if you have something like this, you get enough payoff for it to actually be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Back to the set that we are reviewing. So this set I think is loaded with interesting removal and interaction cards, and I think that's probably the strongest part of the set from a kind of mid-high level cube perspective. Um, Yeah, and I think these commands look like a lot of fun, and for some reason, some of the other ones like Vanishing Verse, I think it's very strong, but it's I don't know if I'm getting old, but it doesn't inspire me a lot. These like new removal variants that are just one for one removal spells, I feel like they all kind of blend together in my mind now, and they don't do a
Yeah.
lot for me design wise.
This highlights that age-old question of, do you want your gold cards to be just more efficient versions of things like removal, or do you want them to be these standout flashy cards in their own right? And so if you're building a Golgari section, or I guess a Witherbloom section for your cube, you can fill that out entirely with several different riffs on like Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy, Maelstrom Pulse, Putrefy, and there are more of those effects than anyone can reasonably play.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, you see Vanishing Verse, and it's okay. This is cool, but so is Vindicate and Mortify, and already the list is just too long to get through. So the none of these are kind of new enough or unique enough to really be eye-catching anymore, unless they're so overpowered that they can't help but catch your eye, in which case you have other problems. So it's more like the expectation for these gold sets has to be, you're going to get a bunch of interesting new options, but none that really drag you in a certain direction, as opposed to some of the like the white red guild in this set is really interesting, I think, not just from a lore perspective or a lore hold perspective,
Uh,
but as a new direction for uh, white design and white red design, where it's not just about, okay, we are the military guild and we're making a bunch of soldiers and we're boosting them and we're attacking you. It's thematically we're different, and that's reflected in our mechanics. And just with the cards in Strixhaven, it's so much more possible now to build a kind of late game or mid range or graveyard centric white red deck, and that's fantastic. And
mm.
that's the biggest pickup from this set for me. It's just all of these cool white red cards that really increase your options for how you can build your cube.
That said, I am pretty cold on Rip Apart. I don't know why. I mean, my cube doesn't have a big artifact enchantment emphasis, so to me, this is kind of like a gold incinerate that can sometimes do something else, but it's not really sparking my interest. And getting to the other cards you mean from Lorehold, I guess there's this Ophrey Ghost Forge and also the Venerable War Singer that I see as interesting red white gold cards.
I think one issue with a card like Rip Apart is, I love modal cards, whether it's charms, commands, confluences, and then modal cards by any other name. But when you have so many of them, and you can just fill out a cube with them now, that's entirely possible. I think there is a certain amount of like decision paralysis that comes along with it, where let's say you have a Silver Quill command in your hand.
Mm.
Already, there are so many permutations of how you could end up using that card, and you have to think about how to optimize it. And then if your hand has 3 or 4 different cards, all of which have roughly the same number of options, well, now it's just you're overloaded with it, and your brain kind of shuts off, and you just decide on a play and you make it. And so I think there is a happy medium to be reached there, and we are past the point now where this card is modal is a good argument by itself for a card, because so many cards are modal nowadays, whether
Mm-hmm.
implicitly or explicitly, that's not any kind of unique selling point. And it can even be a downside when you have too many of them, that it just kind of crowds out seemingly more consequential decisions.
Have you
Like if
seen
I,
those custom cubes where people make it so that every card is a like custom modal card where it's like
yeah,
those always just hurt my head to look at, and I can't imagine drafting it without getting some intense migraine.
it's exactly the kind of thing which is an interesting design exercise, but not actually all that fun to play or to draft. And so if you think about a card like Doomblade, to take a very simple on the face of it card,
Hmm.
that card is inherently modal, right? Because if your opponent is playing a deck with a bunch of creatures, well, I can kill creature A or creature B or creature C, or I could hold it for a hypothetical creature D that might be even bigger and better.
Hmm.
And so, you know, a card like that, which only does one thing, has a bunch of options in a normal game of Magic. Same thing for Lightning Bolt, for example. And if you now have a card where one mode is Doomblade, and then the other three modes are all similarly multifaceted, and then the card itself is more than the sum of its parts, and then you have 3 or 4 of those cards in your hand, you quickly see how this stacks up to the point where it's just unmanageable.
Hmm.
Um, and like this is kind of a crude parallel, but I remember getting my cat out of the way. I remember when the rules changed so that damage didn't use the stack anymore. And the usual suspects on the forums were up in arms because, oh, this is dumbing down Magic, and now this removes the need to understand the rules of the game in order to play at a high level. And if you look, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years after that decision was made, no one would argue that the rules of Magic were not complicated enough or were not deep
Right.
enough. But the idea of damage on the stack was not adding anything of use, and it was only a thing for more experienced players to leverage against less experienced players because they it was counterintuitive enough that they knew how it worked, and of course a new player wouldn't understand it or would get tripped up by it because it doesn't really make sense. And so that was an angle that they learned to exploit. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you want to identify and remove because it's not adding anything to your environment. Likewise with mana burn, right? Yeah, you can find these corner cases where mana burn adds interesting dimensions to a game of Magic, but most of the time it's just this dumb bookkeeping that no one actually enjoys doing. So get rid of it, and we can focus on the many layers of complexity that exist in the average game or set in Magic.
Yeah, I see a lot of those types of mechanics uh, in like competitive esports, and this was especially true for games that kind of predated the online era, where you have some mechanic like I don't know. There's tons of them in Melee, like wave dashing, that sort of thing, which the casual players will never really catch on to, and the experts would kind of swear by keeping them. But I have a number of friends here in town who probably own between 0 and 100 magic cards, and I like to play with them sometimes, and I know that if damage on the stack were still a thing, I would just feel, I don't know, like such a jerk for using it almost, that it's something they wouldn't see coming, and it's just kind of create a feel bad around that. And so I'm glad that's gone, and I certainly agree that a lot of these cards are unnecessarily complex. Um,
So one aspect of that is I think it was on Zebo who raised the question of or Shimizi, excuse me, of there are some cards which you add this additional clause to them, and that opens up all these doors that you can dive deep into. So the example that they gave was, I think, Rampant Growth versus Edge of Autumn, where
mhm,
if you're focusing just on simplicity, as one reading of my comments would imply, then yeah, you go for Rampant Growth over Edge of Autumn, and you ignore this rare use case that only the most experienced players will know how to use properly. But I think that's actually a good example of how that complexity can be smuggled in a good way, where it's it's like how when I was a kid, I would come home after school every day and I would watch The Simpsons because it was on at 6, and that was like a ritual for British kids of my generation, right? And when you're watching The Simpsons and you're 10 years old, there are so many jokes and references that go completely over your head. You
sure.
have no idea what's going on, and often that's okay and that works because those references are just peppered in a seamless enough way that you don't need to get them, and you can still appreciate the overall experience. And the episode itself is still funny because the stuff you do get, tickles the right note for you. Um, and then when you're older and you go back and revisit those episodes, it kind of activates that nostalgia for you even further because, oh, now for the first time, you're getting this joke, which completely passed you by 15 years ago. And I kind of feel like that's what you want to aim for in Cube, where if I see Edge of Autumn, yeah, I'm probably going to gloss over the cycling text the first time I see it. It's just, hey, this can get a land for my deck. That's cool. I'm pretty familiar with that. So let's put that in my deck. And then once I've seen someone else use Edge of Autumn in a certain way to like, dredge a card at instant speed or to act as like a ritual of sorts for Delve or something, it's,
Hmm.
oh wow, that blew my mind. And now I can look for applications like that in the future. So that's kind of what you want. It's where there's a simple base case, and then you can explore the depths of it when you feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah. Uh, we have been playing lately this like Sesame Street jazz album for our baby because he likes it. And there's a joke in there about hypochondriacs, which I don't expect him to ever understand while he's of age to listen to this album, but it's in there for the adults if you want it. Someone in the chat has asked about the Efreet Flamepainter as a build around. They had a few years back, I forget what it's called now, but it was like a 3 mana red double striker that was like a 1/3, and that card never worked for me either. So I don't really see if the opponent has any sort of creature on the board, this connecting. And if they don't have any sort of creature on the board, I think you're already winning probably.
Yeah, I think the difference there is the trigger or triggers here, if you can get both of them, are so good that it's worth sinking a bunch of resources into making that happen. The issue with Flamespeaker I found was that unless you had a convenient way, like an equipment or you one of these green pump effects or something to build that up, let's say you use a removal spell to clear out that blocker so that you can connect with this. Okay, maybe you get a card back from that equation, but you're just kind of spinning your tires, right?
Mm.
Whereas the Flame Painter, if you hit with that, the game might just end. If you can buy back something big enough, or you could use a removal spell so that you can connect, and then that buys back a removal spell, the same one that hits their tapped creature or something. So the payoff here is good enough that it's worth chasing that however you can. And with prophetic flame speaker, and definitely going to confuse flame speaker and flame painter, so
Yeah.
just forgive me for that in advance. But with that card, the range of outcomes is less polarized. It's either, okay, well, I connect, I hit a card, maybe I get to play that card, that's cool. It's an Ophidian, right? It's
Hmm.
when this deals damage, you draw a card under a different name. With Flame Painter, it's, oh wow, I just played Crawl Ultimatum for free basically by connecting with my creature, right? That's a cool story, and it's a cool thing that you want to do. You want to live that dream. Versus if the way to make the flame speaker work, the 1/3 double strike trample, is just to kind of bypass its stat line and just be like, okay, well, this has double strike and trample, that's the relevant part of this card. I'm going to put my sword of X and Y on it and kill you that way. And nothing cool needs to happen in the game for that to be good. It's just I'm attacking you with my creature.
Do you
Whereas with
think this is
this,
gonna make your final 40 though? I feel like if I'm deck building and I see the like range of 4 drops that I have in my cube, that this one ends up in the sideboard almost always.
yeah, this is where you need to take a long and hard look at what your baseline competition is for that slot. And so, especially I find with these kind of 4 mana incentive cards, this is the case where it's, okay, I could do everything I can to make this work. And even then, most of the time, it's still worse than just generically good, Pia and Kiran Nala or something, right? So even in the deck that in theory should be maximized for this card, if I am just looking to win games of Magic, I probably should leave this one on the bench. That's not where you want to be. I think the ideal medium is this card will be worse than the other options most of the time, but if I do make it work, it is the best thing I can be doing. How you get there is another question. Maybe you have to depower the competition. Maybe you sweeten the deal on this card somehow. You add more good cards that this can buy back.
Mm-hmm.
You can approach that from either direction, but I think we are getting to the point where that kind of spell reanimation deck is finally a thing, and that's really exciting for me because that's one way which let's say you have graveyard synergies across all 5 colors. Well, this is a unique twist on that you can build into blue and red. Let's say that your black green creature focus reanimated deck could never hope to emulate, and vice versa. So you have this is like a new incentive card, but there are also in this set Magma Opus, I think, is the rare or mythic rare, which caught my eye here. But so this is a self-discarding big instant or sorcery that also ramps you to the card that buys it back. So
Mm-hmm.
you could discard this card on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you play your Flamepainter, your Wildfire Devils or something, and you hope to get this back. And that fixes the main issue that I mentioned with Reanimator on our previous episode, where if you need your big thing, you need your reanimation effect, and you need the way to bin the big thing. That's a 3-card combo, and that's not easy to assemble most of the time.
Just play Chain of Smog.
Well, sure. What I realize is that stuff like Goblin Welder, for example, is the epitome of that, where you need your Goblin Welder, and often it's exactly Goblin Welder. There's not too much redundancy on that. You need your big artifact, and there aren't that many of those that you can come by either. And then you need your other thing that you can weld as a replacement into that. That's just that's a pipe dream a lot of the time. And ditto with the kind of spell reanimation deck. But I think we're now getting enough good tools for each of those. You can kind of meld them all together at the same time, right? Like this card creates a treasure token. You can weld away that treasure token, or if you have artifact synergies like the Izzet Elder Dragon in this set, or Prismari one, it cares about artifacts and spells at the same time. So it's a nice bridging of the gap there. So you could conceivably take these themes, which were mostly kind of siloed individually before, and bring them together. And that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, and I appreciate the design space that they're exploring, and I think that treasure tokens make sense as something that they're making more evergreen, and I think they have a lot of good play to them. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how this fleshes out. There's already a lot of historical Izzet cards that care about like high converted mana cost things, and I'm not sure that that's like where you want to go with every cube, but it's something that I kind of meddled with in the Eldrazi domain cube, which is at a lower power level. So I think for people who are at lower power level cubes, there's an increasing number of like appealing archetypes that you can support.
Or you're me, and you try to trick yourself into making this work in a higher power level cube, and then you really have to ask yourself tough questions about what your design goals are and what you can actually afford to play. So I love seeing these cards being printed, but it's terrible news for me because I will trap myself into going down these rabbit holes time and time again.
Yeah, I was actually, as soon as I saw the learn mechanic spoiled, I thought of you because you have this cube with so much discard synergy, and that, I imagine in your cube a card like Conspiracy Theorist is going to slot right in and never leave. Am I wrong in that?
That's actually a card that I'm warning myself about, because in theory, it's a good like discard piece for an engine, but I don't know if it actually does that in practice. I think that one might be worse than it says on the tin.
Yeah, we'll have to see when the playtesting coming around. Uh, how about this commemorative Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa card? I think that seems pretty universally hyped up.
Yeah, it's a good card. It's a new direction in white, and this is if you are familiar with Frogkin Kidnapper from the Mystery Booster set, this is the kind of importing of that into a normal set now, in white, no less, a color which normally does not get any kind of discard or peaking effect. So
Hmm.
it's cool new design space for white. Obviously, a card that has a lot of personal resonance for its designer, of course, and it's a new kind of blink payoff as well. If you're interested in that kind of thing, where like if you you spellbinder them, you take one card, and then you blink this, you take another card, and this doesn't have the clause that something like a Fiend Hunter would have, where
Hmm.
once this leaves, the card comes back. No, this takes the card away, and then if your 3/1 topples over in a mild breeze, then that card is still off in its corner, demanding that you pay the extra cost for it. So you conceivably you play this, you blink it somehow, you could just take 2 or 3 cards from their hand, and now they really have to wait a long time to get those back in the game again.
How do you think this compares to Vendilion Click?
I think Clique is a much better card, and that's actually, I think, the model for this card, because for Paolo, that is his favorite card of all time. So being on a new twist on Clique is exactly where he wants to be. I think Clique is uh it's just a great card overall. Something that I would not complain about seeing in any blue section. Really, this isn't that card. I don't think this is an automatic inclusion by any means for anyone. But again, not going to fault anyone for putting it in their list.
Sure. Um, so we have a number of other interaction disruption spells. I'm quite a fan of Reject, mostly because I really like the counter spells that exile, and I guess that's because I have a lot of kind of like Gravecrawler recursive type of effects, and that it's nice to give blue some counterplay.
Mm.
What do you think about multiple choice?
This might be the example of what I was saying with, it's modal for the sake of being modal. Because if you look at the effects on this card, the base case of scry one, draw a card, you're overpaying for that, but that's fine. The X is 2 mode of a player returns a creature of their choice. That's not appealing. You don't want to do that by yourself. It's just part of the final package if you get to that final mode.
I feel like this is
And
part of the commander thing that they want you to use this as
yes,
like a negotiating thing of like, oh, who can I bargain with to let them rebuy one of their strong enter the battlefield effects.
yeah, it's a great clause for multiplayer for sure. And then you can pay 4 mana for a 4/4, and that's fine, but a little weird to see in blue. But hey, let's go with it. And then you can tie the whole thing together. I like the card. It's just it's a kind of thing which, if I was looking to simplify my cube, remove some of that unnecessary complexity, I would be looking at this one with a critical eye.
Sure. Um all right, and now we're getting to the kind of
The
assorted.
hodgepodge. Yeah.
Yeah. These I feel like are mostly take it or leave it based on what your cube does. I expect for some people this flying bird that lets you snap back your self-targeting spells will be quite a linchpin. I
I
think
uh I want to get on my soapbox about that one quickly, because so the way this is set up, where you can in theory buy back anything, but if it's not a card that would target your own thing and costs 8 more, it is a lot. You are not, I guess maybe in a super long game of Commander or something, it could work, but by and large, you are only ever buying back something that can target your own thing. But you have this wacky looking extra cost in there, because I don't know if this card actually functions under the rules otherwise. I don't think you can specify a card that could target a thing you control before it actually does that thing. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but
Hmm.
it's like, to make this functional, you might have to add this clause, which in turn is a distraction from everything else that it has going on and just complicates the card even further. I don't know. It's a weird one, not one that I'm too interested in myself. The thing that really gets me is, can we look up Augusta? I think it's the backside. Maybe Plang is the front
Augusta?
one. Yeah, Plag. Okay.
Plarg.
But I don't know if the double G changes the pronunciation there. If it's like a Greg with one G versus Greg with two G's kind of situation.
Could
But
be.
so there are people talking about this card in standard white aggro decks, because if you look at Augusta, you have 3 mana for a card that's like an anthem that comes with it, and you can like toggle which, whether your creatures are tapped or untapped. So yeah, a good rate for that kind of card, right? And if you compare this to like a Soltari Champion or something, or a Benalish Marshal, it's pretty easy to cast, but it gets most of the functionality in there. But let's go back to the other side quickly. Let's take a look at Plug in all of its majesty. So this is a red card, right? If this card is in your hand, it is a red card. You just see this, and the art is full of flames and everything, and it's bright and colorful.
Uh-huh.
So you can be playing a white aggro deck where you open your hand and there's just this red card that may as well just be like a Charizard or something, right? You literally cannot cast this card. There are no red sources in your deck. This is totally uncastable. And the only way that this card does anything is if you get it out of its sleeve and you turn it around and you play this card, which in itself takes a few readings to fully understand what's going on. And this is just the new norm of things now. That this is how it works. And so once you're priced into doing that, once you are only playing this card for the backside of it, you then have people asking, should I be playing the white-red pathway land? Because that can be just a basic planes if I want it to be, right? But
Uh-huh.
if I draw my Plug and I want to cast my Plug, which is only in my deck by accident because I don't even want it, but it's just there because it's on the card, then if I draw my other thing, which is kind of free and also has 2 sides on it, then I can play one of those sides, which in turn I also need to turn around to for the color I want it most of the time, so that I can then cast my Plug that's just in my deck for no good reason. It's the best of a situation.
Yeah, I had this thought earlier while we were talking about Kosuma, and that so far when I've played with this, every time I've wanted to play it as the front side, and I know there is the back side, and probably it's correct to use the back side sometime, but I feel like someone got it in their head that it'd be really fun for constructed that we put legendaries on both sides, so that if one's in play, they're forced to use the other side, and that's why we get all of these things where you have a legendary on both side. And I feel like if you do a total word count on like the combined 2 sides, this has got to be in like the top like 20 cards. Like probably 15 of the top 20 of all time are in this set.
Yeah, I think there are some cards which might make that list just by virtue of one of their faces, and now the other face is like catapulting them several
Yeah.
positions up the list. I think there was some, maybe it was a Reddit thread or a Twitter thread or something, where someone talked about the most wordy cards of all time, and yeah, okay, here it is. So
You can drop me a link if you want.
yeah, let's link that here. So yeah, call time has
Where what
14,500.
did you put it in Zoom?
Yeah, I'll link it there. So this is saying call time was the most wordy set of all time, and the 3 next most wordy sets were all in the past 18 months or so. You got Ikoria, Zendikar Rising, and then Throne of Eldraine. And If you then break it down on a card by card basis, it goes Coldheim at 33, Future Sight of all sets at 31. And if you're more wordy than Future Sight, you know that some barrier has been broken somewhere.
Mhm.
And then going on down the list, you got your Planet Chaos, Cold Snap, which was meant to emulate Ice Age Block, which was famously opaque and obtuse in its wording of cards. And then you go down the list, you get to Modern Masters, which is meant to be a set aimed at more enfranchised players, and you keep going down the line. So sets are getting more and more wordy and complex, and this is like whenever you see a design that isn't for you, it's kind of tough to complain about that in the Magic kind of discourse nowadays, because the response is always, "Oh, well, this isn't for you." That's not everything has to be for you. I feel like I am the person for whom this kind of wordiness for its own sake does appeal. And even I am, having these these questions about it now.
Yeah. All right. For some reason, I couldn't like open up the Zoom chat while we were in that, so I've
I've
got your
sent it in Discord.
yeah. Yeah, I see it now. Yeah, I wonder. I thought that the game would be moving in the opposite direction of this. I mean, I I know that one of the upsides to me of like playing Hearthstone or Slay the Spire is that you can have these 10 card hands, but everything is pretty parsable because the cards are fairly word light, and that the complexity comes from, the way that you can combine it and the choices you have to make about opportunity cost between them and all that. Um, is Magic just so old that they're running through the elegant design space, or why is this happening?
I don't know. Your thoughts match up with mine here, because when you have so many clones, I'll say that of Magic in the environment, um, one area on which Magic can be kind of outfoxed is just simplicity, right? There is so much baggage inherent in the Magic rules engine, that if you were designing it from scratch, I know they've said it would look a lot different. And if you are designing one of these new games, you are designing it from scratch, and it can be uh, much more efficient and much more intuitive. And so you would think Magic would be more cautious than ever of going too far in that other direction, especially with the move to mobile. And my understanding is the Arena mobile client is actually surprisingly good from the feedback that
It
I've
looks
heard so
good,
far.
yeah.
But I imagine like you're in the bathroom or something, and you're like squinting your phone to try and make out the text on one side of these hopelessly complicated double face cards with all
Hmm.
of the other stuff that's going on in your hand, on the board, on the screen. Like there's so much there, that just chipping away at some part of that feels like it should be an utmost priority.
Well, they did chip away at it. They changed CMC to MV, and now we have mana value
that
and
that
cards with 200 words.
Yeah, that change frees up another 10 characters that we can use for more just like random abilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand it, and I guess the to me, I want to, and in a way, I do like the set so much. There's just some things to me that are real head scratchers, and that's definitely. I don't know why everything's so wordy.
For
Um,
me, the set has the exact opposite vibe from Kaldheim, where with that set, it didn't feel that cohesive to me, and there was just a ton of stuff going on. But in terms of individual card designs, that might be the longest review I've ever had to write for my cube, just because there were so many cards that had interesting applications.
Hmm.
With this set, I think it's a lot more cohesive on the whole, and I like the overall vibe of it. I like a lot of what's going on, but I don't think there's going to be many cards from the set that stick around in my cube for years to come. And I think it is an all or nothing kind of thing where if your cube is at the power level where the lesson and learning mechanics can slot in, well, that in itself is a big package that you can fully embrace. But you can't there's no half measures there.
Hmm.
You either do that or you don't. And likewise, with Magecraft, that's not a kind of a accidental thing that you dabble in from time to time. Either you care about instants and sorceries or you don't. And so that combined with the gold focus of the set, where if the normal model of a cube is we have maybe 5 or 6 cards in each color pair, and those are very tightly controlled, and it's hard to break into those, then yeah, the set is not going to have that much for you.
Hmm. I even think about, so I tend to play a lot of Cube online with James, and he's someone who's been playing Magic for a long time, but I also know from his personality type that he will not have looked at the visual spoiler in any detail. He
Mm.
won't have taken all these cards to memory. He's not making a set review of it. So if I include like one of these dual face cards in there, and then we have the viewers draft decks, and one of them ends up in James's deck, I know when he draws that, that's gonna end up being like 90 seconds of dead air on the stream while he has to read through this
it's
essay of a card for the first time.
it's almost like he's leaking information, right? You can tell what he must have just drawn because he's taking that
Yeah.
long to read it.
So I I can't justify putting it in there. All right, someone in the chat asked about what do I think about the Blade Reforged, Layla.
Yeah, so this is a card from the Commander deck, so they're coming out
Oh,
for this
right.
year alongside this set, and it's always been a little confusing because this happened with Ikoria as well, where those sets dropped at exactly the same time, and you couldn't tell easily which card was in one and which was in the other. And so
Hmm.
there were some really juiced up mutate cards, for example, that I was thinking, all right, this is going to be busted in standard. And then I realized, all right, false alarm, this card was never going to be in standard to begin with. But certainly the Boros cards or the white red cards in the commander decks are just as interesting and groundbreaking as the ones in the main set itself, and later is a good example of those. So this is I've seen even the Power Max Vintage Cube crowd talk about this as that they're going to upgrade their fourth best Goblin Rabble Master variant into this because it's such an appealing card, and it also is. So let's can we bring up the card itself
Yeah,
just to zoom
I've.
in?
I'll click on it here.
Yeah. So
You want
this
me to
is
zoom further?
Yeah, so this is 2 and a red for a 2/2 haste. When it attacks, you exile the top card of your library, and you can play it this turn. And note the play versus cast there. So if you hit a land, you can play that post combat.
Hmm.
And whenever you exile one or more cards from your library and or graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So immediately you play this, you attack, it exiles a card, it gets a counter. So you have a 3/3 haste attacking the first turn. The next turn, you attack, you exile another card, which you're likely to be able to play now because you haven't spent 3 mana on this.
Yeah.
And you're attacking with a 4/4. And then if you have any other way to pump this up, this grows very quickly. So Grim Lovemancer, Bomat Courier, it's easy to find these when you go looking for them. Even something like Scavenging Ooze,
Hmm.
right? Where individually, because those are separate instances, you pay green, you pump up your ooze, you pump up your Ladia, you keep attacking.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of this is the model of like a Tyler Tracker kind of card, right? Where it's just a good card that goes in most decks that can cast it, but also there's a lot of it gets the cogs turning as to how to use it most effectively.
Yeah, I do think that this seems very like cohesive as a design, and certainly anytime you see this sort of uh, card advantage engine, you're drawn to it. I wonder if it will feel too strong in the way that white 2-drop we talked about did. What was that card called again?
The Luminarch aspirant.
Yeah.
I don't think it will, just because this card does have to enter combat to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, if you can block it effectively, you can do that. Whereas the aspirant just kind of sits there, beefing up itself, beefing up everything else to the point where they can get into combat, and there's not much you can do.
Yeah. I think this will be. I mean, like a 3/3 haste for 3 is already like a very good stat line for this sort of card. And if you attack twice for it, you're getting way kind of above the curve that you would get from other beaters. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do think it's like a interesting, satisfying card, and I'll definitely run it. It's just one that I'll have my eye on for potential removal.
If you want a more sophisticated Splinter Twin situation with this card, look up Thought Lash quickly.
Okay,
Oh, it's a space. Okay, well,
I found it.
there we go. So, firstly, the art of this card is just bizarre, but the card
Uh huh.
itself is incredibly freaky. So you just get to exile your library on demand, basically. So this works with Thassa's Oracle, or the Jace from War of the Spark, or
Hmm.
really so many different cards to do a bunch of weird things. But you could curve Layla into this and just flip over your deck, make it a 40/40 on turn for whatever, and win the game. So I don't expect people to actually do that, but hey, if you want a
I don't think it becomes a
original
forty
twist,
forty, does it? It says one or more cards.
well, so that's the thing that makes it a little confusing is that let's say you cast a light up the stage, you're exiling 2 cards, but that's all in one motion effectively. So that only gets it 1 counter. But with the Thought Lash, okay, I activate this, it triggers, the ability resolves, and we're back to where we
Oh,
started.
I was
And then I do it
still.
again and again and
I was
again
reading the
and so on.
second line of it about if the cumulative upkeep isn't paid to remove your library from the
Oh,
game.
sure.
I hadn't even gotten to the third paragraph of this. Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. Yet another card that I will not be including, but it's a fun fun combo to think about. Um, are there any other cards from this set that you wanted to bring up before we wrap things up?
Not really from the main set, I think. There's Cursed Mirror, which is another of these commander preview cards, which I think is really cool.
All right. That's an interesting effect and some evocative art, I will say.
Yeah, so this is another area of design space that they've looked at a bit more recently of mana rocks that also do some silly thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, you have this question of, do I just play out the mirror on turn 3 because I need to accelerate, or do I hold it so that when there is a juicy target on either side of the battlefield, you can copy your opponent's stuff too, that you just kind of take that by surprise. And this as a clone with haste, this is the cheapest version of that effect, I'm pretty sure. Like, we've had Dax duplicate in the past, or there are various things where you can like threaten a creature for a turn,
Mm.
for not much mana. But usually what you find is, like, even when you clone something, that's only good for a turn or so anyway. So this being limited to 1 turn, I think, is fine. And then you also get into these silly sequences of like, oh, I play Sun Titan, get this back, copy the Sun Titan, get something else back, and now that second copy has haste, so I attack and I get a third thing back, and it's you can do some really wacky stuff with this, and there will be a lot of fun stories involving this card.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't dug too much into the commander spoilers yet, but we can revisit them when I guess they'll all be coming out over the course of the next week.
Yeah, and the first day of those had so many cool cards that I was saying to you yesterday, maybe we should put this off until all of those have come out, just so that we have the whole thing to talk about. Day two of those spoilers hasn't seemed as deep so far, unfortunately, but
Hmm.
hopefully the rest of the week will have some treats for us.
I didn't realize until today that so I saw Abundant Harvest in the Mystical Archives, and I didn't realize there was a new card. I figured it was just one that I missed.
Well, Jason, you you could be forgiven for that because it's actually a card that exists in Modern Horizons 2, which is only a month or two away at this point. Um, but it's kind of previewed in the Mystical Archive. So this card will be
Ah,
legal in at least historic on Arena and maybe in like Legacy or something before it's officially been released as a card in a Magic set.
okay.
So fun fact for you there.
I do like it though. I mean, it seems like a what you want out of a green one drop spell.
Yeah, I don't know how good this card actually is. I think some people are treating it as this is the equivalent of brainstorm or ponder in green. I don't think that's really the case. I think you can't just slot this into any green deck, but it's an interesting card. I just think it's maybe more narrow than some people are giving it credit for.
Yeah, I guess what I've come to appreciate about Oath of Nissa is that it leaves this dumb permanent behind that you can then sacrifice to your like Vraska Golgari Queen or whatever you want. Um, and I even had, I think for the first time ever, this writer line of text about casting planeswalkers be relevant last week when I played a game. So I don't know that I like it better than Oath of Nissa for my own cube, but
I do get some weird enjoyment out of having this thing lying around that has served its purpose and getting to sacrifice it to something else, whether
yeah.
it's Vraska, Doom Foretold, Montu, whatever. Like I don't know why that pleases me so much, but it does.
Hmm. Yeah, that's also a fun thing that you can do with the sagas is that a lot of them will kind of give you the majority of their value in say the first two turns, and then you have this fun decision point about whether you want to sack it or get the third tick off of the saga.
Hmm.
Um, okay, I think we've gone over most of the cards that I had in mind. Do you have any closing thoughts on the set or extra things you wanted to fit in there?
I don't think so. If we were going over individual cards, I think this would be a much shorter episode than if we did that for like Kaldheim or a lot of the sets recently.
Mm,
I know some people say they kind of like that, especially with the cadence of the set releases now, where we have Strixhaven, Kaldheim was not that long ago. We've got the Commander set coming out at the same time, and then Modern Horizons 2, which is going to be an absolute banger for cubes, I think, is in June, I believe. So maybe it's fine to just give the wallet a month off, for me, I just like seeing cool new cards all the time, so that aspect doesn't boggle my mind too much. But you know, I, I'm not disappointed with this set really, even though I don't expect to include that many cards from it.
no. This set does make me want to do something I don't often do a lot, which is play a bunch of retail limited.
Yes, yeah.
And I hope it's not like Return to Ravnica, where for some reason I just like force the same two color pair every draft, even when it's not appropriately open. But I think there's a lot of kind of fun angles that they've taken these color pairs into, and I expect it to be quite a fun draft set.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Dom, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. One final question. What is your favorite faction for Retail Limited?
Favorite faction? I don't know which is going to be the best. I guess the Prismari, just because I like the whole big spells vibe of like we do some experiment and then oh look, we just blew up the chemistry lab or something. That's a kind of cool angle to be pushing. And I think with the lesson stuff, even though again Magecraft is across all 5 colors, I expect blue red to still be the best at exploring that angle, and I think the lesson stuff ties into that pretty well.
Yeah, I'd probably have to go the same with Witherbloom. Over the years, I think green black in general has become my favorite color pair. I feel like there's so many fun angles you can do with that in cube, and I am hoping the same applies here, and we'll get lots of little creatures that want to die anyways, which is always a favorite of mine. But I'm looking forward to drafting it and finding out. And that's all for us, and we'll see you whenever we record the next one. Bye!